has to rewrite history, not because the new generation is more intelligent than the old one, and not even, or not only, because new information has come to light, but especially, I think, because the function of a historian, rather like that of a translator, is to interpret the past to the present, like to translate the language of the past into the language of the present, and the present keeps changing. Current debates about contemporary issues provoke historians to ask new questions about the past. At the time of the great inflation of the 1920s, historians began to write the history of prices. In the 1950s, when there was a great debate on the population explosion, that was the time that historical demography became really established. So what about today? I think it's no accident that historians are turning to three topics in particular. In the first place, obviously, the history of the environment. In the second place, the history of knowledge, I think linked to debates about whether we're living in a knowledge society or information society. And finally, but I would say last but not least, they're becoming increasingly interested in cultural hybridity, which is linked to cultural globalization, waves of migration, and so on. And as you know, in the course of the last generation, cultural hybridity has become the focus of attention not only among historians, actually not even mainly among historians, but in a number of different disciplines. The interest goes back at least to the 1930s, but in the 1930s, interest was almost confined to specialists on the Caribbean and Brazil. Indeed, the two leading writers on the subject themselves came from the Caribbean and Brazil, that is Fernando Ortiz, a sociologist in Cuba, and Gilberto Freire, historian, anthropologist, sociologist, who came from Recife in the state of Pernambuco in northeast Brazil. So it was still a rather unusual thing to do in the 30s. But today we've got anthropologists, sociologists, scholars working in cultural studies and so on, all increasingly interested in cultural encounters, cultural exchanges, and what is known in Romance languages as métissage, mestiçage, or mestiçage, that is interbreeding both literally and metaphorically. So the rise of these concepts is one of the few successes of what some people call Southern theory, produced on the cultural periphery in Havana and Recife, but then taken up with increasing enthusiasm by scholars working near the intellectual center, wherever that now is. And as I say, the growth of interest in the topic today is no surprise in an age of such intense migration. Indians and West Indians in Britain, Turks in Germany, Moroccans in France. The whole world seems to be becoming Brazil, complete, of course, with debates about assimilation, multiculturalism, and so on. Now, I think that historians have quite an important role to play in this interdisciplinary field, especially because historians obviously focus on process, and much has been written about hybridity, rather less about the process of cultural hybridization. I'd like to distinguish three stages in the process. So first, the moment of cultural encounter, when people from one culture observe for the first time people from another one and just register contrasts, differences. The second stage of appropriation, but appropriation only of fragments of the other culture. Fragments that are often juxtaposed to elements in the home culture without them mixing. I think of that as the equivalent of what linguists would call a pidgin, which is a simplified language used as a lingua franca between two groups, drawing on the language of both. The third and final stage, perhaps the most interesting stage, is what we might call crystallization, or if you prefer, fusion. That is, the integration of those borrowed fragments into a new system. So, linguists would say creolization, thinking in particular of those cases in which a pidgin, which was everybody's second language, turns into some people's first language and naturally becomes much more complex in the process. Complex in vocabulary, but also much more complex in the syntax. Alternatively, changing metaphors, this third phase might be described as the formation of local ecotypes. I borrowed this term from a Swedish folklorist, Carl von Sydow, not very well known today except as the father of the great Swedish actor Max von Sydow, but actually a very important figure in Lund University and in folklore in his own right. I keep talking about metaphor because metaphor seems to be unavoidable in this domain. We can borrow from botany, hybridity, ecotype, borrow from metallurgy, fusion, amalgamation, borrow from craftsmanship, like Lévi-Strauss talking about intellectual bricolage, and maybe above all borrow from language, creolization, cultural translation, a concept I'd like to return to later on. Using these metaphors, I should say, doesn't worry me. I think metaphors are welcome in academic discourse, provided we're conscious that we're using them. To quote another Swede, a friend of mine this time, Ulf Hammers, it's okay to take a ride on a metaphor on condition that you know when to get off. So what I'd like to do now is to explore what we call the culture of the Renaissance from this angle, hybridity. I should say a long Renaissance, going well into the 17th century. In some ways, I'm rather tempted to go even further. You know, Jacques Le Goff talks about a long Middle Ages, which comes to an end only in 1789. So if he can do that, maybe I can talk about a Renaissance that begins maybe in the 14th century with people like Petrarch, but goes on until the classical style of architecture is displaced by the Gothic revival sometime in the 19th century. But actually, today I'll be mainly talking about the 15th, 16th, early 17th centuries. Well, of course, the movement we now call the Renaissance is hybrid by definition, in the sense that it's an attempt by people living inside one culture, that of late medieval Europe, to revive another one, the culture of classical antiquity, especially in the first place, Rome. All the same, I want to suggest, maybe you'll find this controversial, that insufficient attention has been paid to the process of hybridization, which took place in this period in a great variety of situations and locale, from Florence itself to, let's say, Arequipa in Brazil, which is in Peru, which is going to appear in a few minutes as one of the images. We could look at this process at two levels: a macro historical level, global level, if you like, and a micro historical level when we talk about individuals and small groups. So at the macro historical level, I like to think of the contact, you could even say the collision, between what might be called in the structuralist language of the 1960s two rival systems of science, that is, the Gothic system of science and the classical system. Both systems penetrated into so many domains: media, materials, stone, wood, metals, textiles, parchment, shaping and decorating objects ranging from large cathedrals to tiny gems. But at the microhistorical level, then we see a variety of individual or group responses to this collision. And I'd like to distinguish three responses in particular. So one reaction is what linguists would call code switching, but it doesn't only apply to language. So let's take the case of Italian painting in the 15th century, or more precisely, let's take one artist, Pisanello. He painted in two distinct styles. One that the art historians feel comfortable in calling Gothic, and another one which they call Renaissance. You might have thought, and indeed I believe art historians once thought, that he was converted. At one point in his career, he discovered the Renaissance and changed style, but not a bit of it. He practiced the two styles simultaneously. Working for one patron, he would do something more traditional, and working for another patron, he would do something more modern. Second reaction to the collision, self-conscious hybridization. We could call it maybe syncretism, because syncretism is a sample of this kind of syncretism. Ficino sees himself as christening Plato, but equally well he might be described as Platonizing Christianity. Or turning to literature, think of Ariosto, a poet who was extremely familiar with two very different traditions: the classical tradition of the epic, especially Virgil, and the tradition of the medieval romance of chivalry. Because people didn't stop reading romances of chivalry when the Renaissance happened. And right through the 16th century into the early 17th century, if not later, you can find that the favorite reading, not only of the nobility, men and women, but substantial number of the middle class as well, were these romances of chivalry. Indeed, in Italian schools, in order to get the children to take education more, take a greater interest in education, they learned to read from books that were known locally as libri di battaglie, in North Italian dialect, books of battles. So right through the Renaissance, they are beginning to learn to read with these chivalrous romances, and only afterwards then they go on to the harder classical tradition. And so, in the case of Ariosto, he has two traditions available, and he plays with both. In a sense, he's writing a romance of chivalry, and he's mocking romances of chivalry all at once. And thanks to the coexistence of these traditions, he's able to do this and to take his readers with him. That was the second reaction, and then there's the third possibility, and this is the one that I think is normally not conscious to the people who are engaged in the practice. It depends on what Pierre Bourdieu famously calls the habitus, that is, knowledge and skills that have become so thoroughly internalized that they cease to be conscious. A habitus it's learned by imitating somebody else, but it becomes second nature. In the case of boxers, in the case of sculptors, and need I say, in the case of lecturers as well. Artisans, masons, carpenters, painters who are asked to work in a new style may assimilate it without meaning to their traditional craft habitus. I got this idea incidentally from this gifted Brazilian historian Gilberto Freire, who was thinking about a totally different context, but writing the history of Brazil in the early 19th century. And when in certain cities, such as Rio de Janeiro, English culture became extremely fashionable, though it had to compete with French culture. And an enthusiasm for English culture included the desire to have English furniture in the house. So Chippendale chairs made in England were imported into Brazil in the early 19th century. But there weren't enough of them. And of course people had the idea, well, why not ask local craftsmen to copy these designs? The local craftsmen were slaves, so they came out of the West African tradition. It might even be that some of them had learned to be their craft in West Africa before having been enslaved. In any case, what Freire notes, he says, in the climate of Brazil, I don't know whether that's a joke or whether he really thinks that this is how things work, those angular English chairs were transformed and every straight line turned into a curve. But the basic point, I think, is that was the way in which the African craftsmen thought with their hands, and they couldn't do it another way. So they are given an alien design, they translate it without even meaning to, or maybe realizing that they're doing it. And I think with craftsmen trained in the Gothic style, who are then required to produce a classical capital, Ionic or something, you get that kind of interference. Indeed, even when, well, maybe it's not so surprising, when Brunelleschi is designing some of the first Renaissance churches in Florence, and you look very hard at some of the classical capitals, they don't look quite right. But after all, these are the first Renaissance churches, and so it takes time for the craftsmen to adapt to the new situation. Or take the case of handwriting. The scribes writing in humanist cursive, that famous new style developed by Poggio Bracciolini and others, believing that they are reviving the handwriting of classical antiquity, though in fact they're reviving Carolingian minuscule rather instead. But the thing is, it's very different from the Gothic script which those scribes had learned when they were children. And paleographers have sometimes pointed out that in the handwriting of some Italian scribes of the 15th century, most of the time they are writing humanist cursive, but every now and again traditional Gothic forms break through. Maybe they weren't concentrating enough on something, and then habit takes over. It's a kind of return of the repressed. But it's got, it makes, there are visible signs of it then in different media. In parenthesis, I just want to note an interesting circular tour. Where did Burke get the idea of habitus? Well, ultimately from Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas, but more immediately, actually, I asked him this once, and he said he got it directly from Erwin Panofsky, the great historian of Renaissance art, in particular, from that famous essay on Gothic architecture and scholasticism, which Burke liked so much that he translated it into French and wrote an introduction for it. And so, if I'm using Burke to understand the reception of the Renaissance, then the circle is completed. We started with Gothic and Renaissance, and we go back to it. Now, as I was suggesting, properly to assess the importance of the process of hybridization in this big cultural movement which affected so many countries, one has to investigate an extremely diverse number or range of cultural items. Language, literature, painting, sculpture, even law, because there's a kind of cultural encounter between Roman law and customary law in many parts of Europe, so that some humanists like Jacques Couillasse in the south of France developed the idea of there being a feudal law, and that's somebody trained in Roman law and reflecting on medieval customary law is coming out with these ideas. Well, you can imagine I can't deal with all this in the compass of a single lecture, so what I thought I would do from now on is to focus sharply on a single art form, that is architecture. And I chose it not at random, or even because I'm specially interested, but because I think architecture is particularly likely to be hybrid for several different reasons. I mean, in the first place, patrons played a greater part in commissioning buildings than in commissioning paintings, though they certainly sometimes laid down the program for paintings as well. But they have practical needs. Sometimes the practical needs conflict with what the architect would like to do, and hybridity may be the result of a compromise. I mean, there are famous cases, recurrent cases from the 15th century to the 17th, of Renaissance architects who would have liked to build a circular church because on the model of circular temples of antiquity, but then the patron, usually a powerful churchman, maybe a bishop, insists that the cross plan has to be followed, and then they follow it. This is right up to Christopher Wren and St Paul's Cathedral in London. He didn't want to build it on the plan that was eventually chosen. In the second place, obviously, architecture is a collective art, collective business. Architects, masons, carpenters working together. Indeed, the distinction between architect and master mason is only emerging in Italy in the 15th century itself, and a bit later in other places. I think the word is often, in a number of European vernaculars, it's a 16th century word. So you have conflict, and again, you have compromise, and compromise more or less means hybridity. In the third place, painters might ignore local conditions, but architects do this at their peril. They have to think about climate, they have to think about local supplies of stone or whatever. And in the very long term, think also of the phenomenon of buildings that were constructed in one period, restored, extended in a completely different period. Well, as you know, many times people don't bother, they just go ahead in a new style so that you can walk into a church and half of it's Gothic and half of it's Baroque. That's hybrid in one sense, but the two halves are, in a sense, not speaking to one another. More interesting, I think, are the cases that you get in the 17th century, which is why I wanted to extend into the 17th century, of architects who are asked to restore or to finish medieval cathedrals. And although they work in a classical style, they feel that they have to, can I say, Gothicize or medievalize so as to create a harmonious whole. One famous case, the Duomo in Milan. I mean, from a distance, it looks like a medieval cathedral. If you look at the facade of the west front in any detail, you do find all sorts of classical ornament. So the architect made a big effort to harmonize, but still you can see that this is a 17th century edition. And as a Londoner myself, I can't help mentioning Westminster Abbey, a marvelous medieval building, but they didn't finish the west front. Not until the 17th century. Christopher Wren was asked to finish the west front. So the upper half of the two great towers of Westminster Abbey are his work. And again, from a distance, medieval, but when you look at some of the details rather classical. So in what follows, I want to discuss Renaissance architecture in 3 parts of the world. So in Italy, in other parts of Europe, but finally beyond Europe, and especially in the Americas, that is, especially Spanish America. So let me go first to Italy, and then this would be a nice moment for it was appropriate enough, of course, that the classical style should be revived in Italy, an area where there were so many classical buildings still surviving, and indeed many more still surviving in the 15th century than have survived today, owing to the practice of stealing marble from ancient buildings in order to build the Renaissance and Baroque monuments we so much admire in Italy today. Now, imitating those buildings was not as easy as it may seem in retrospect. That is, it was easy to imitate the vocabulary, but it took time to discover the grammar or syntax, that is, the rules according to which the different pieces were assembled. It took generations, it seems, to learn this. A well-known example is the use of the orders. Doric capitals on the ground floor, Ionic on the first floor, Corinthian on the second floor. But these rules were often broken in the Renaissance, and sometimes it's a puzzle for historians to decide whether they were broken deliberately or out of misunderstanding. Take the case, I'm afraid I didn't have a picture for this, the castle in Heidelberg. It's the great ruin in red sandstone called the Ott Heinrich-Bau. So it's rather late in the 16th century. And it doesn't follow the rules. But does it not follow the rules because a German architect still in the 1580s had not discovered how one should combine these orders? Or is it an early German example of mannerism, that is the practice of breaking the rules for fun, which you find in Giulio Romano and the Palazzo del Te in Mantua already in the 1520s. And I think the jury is still out. I don't think there's any consensus among art historians as to whether it's rather naive or extremely sophisticated. It has to be one extreme or the other. But in any case, and this is the point I want to insist on most, borrowing from antiquity was not necessarily viewed at the time as incompatible with a taste for Gothic. This is the architectural equivalent of Pisanello, really. So take the case here. Antonio Rossellino, designing this cathedral for Pope Pius II in his native city, which we know as Pienza, but it was of course only renamed Pienza by the Pope in his own honor. Good Renaissance man, he had no scruples about showing off in this way. Now, outside, I think in many ways this looks like a classical facade. But then you go inside, and I think the first impression is overwhelmingly Gothic because of the ribbed vaulting, for example. And it's true that when you look more closely, let's see if I can make this thing work. Doesn't matter if it's on. Yes, that's right. So somewhere like that, those the capitals, they are a bit more classicizing than one might expect from a Gothic church. But you've got Gothic tracery in the windows, but then you've often got round arches. So it is, I think, quite definitely a hybrid. Now, what did the patron think about this? And that was why I chose this particular example, because it's exceptionally well documented. Thanks to the fact that Pius, a humanist as well as a pope, he wrote a great deal, and these writings have been preserved. Now, earlier in his career, he was a papal diplomat, and he lived in Central Europe. He even wrote about it. And he praised the Gothic churches of what he called Germany. And intriguingly, he selected for special praise one Gothic church, and that was Strasbourg Cathedral, which I think is very intriguing, since that's the very building that Goethe praised in a famous text, which did so much to encourage the Gothic revival in the 19th century. So Pius, whose other works of patronage show his sensibility to Renaissance or classical forms, could also enjoy Gothic forms. Posterity sees Gothic and classical as antithetical styles. It seems some contemporaries may have regarded them as equally attractive alternatives, and even had no objection to a kind of bricolage. But now I'll move away from Italy into just a few parts of Europe. Of course, one could look at almost every part of Europe from this point of view. Now, in 16th century Europe, it's not at all difficult to find both medieval structures, or medieval type structures, combined with classical ornament, or alternatively, classical structures which still have at least traces of Gothic ornament. We might speak of conflicting pressures on the patrons. On one side, the desire to be fashionably classical, and on the other, the need to continue to build castles and churches, medieval building types, which hadn't existed in classical antiquity, so one can't imitate them exactly. So this is, of course, Francis I, or François I's Chambord, and it was built by an Italian architect. That is, it was built to his design. That was Domenico da Cortona. But would you see it as a medieval building or a classical style building? Seems to me the ground plan, it's a medieval fortress with all these bulging round towers. But of course a lot of the details, the windows obviously, and some of the decoration on the roof, that is Italianate, or at the very least it's Italianizing. Or take a case which for me is much closer to home. This is a small piece of the Palace of Hampton Court, which was built for his own pleasure by Cardinal Wolsey early in the 16th century, but on such a grand scale that people made rude remarks that it was grander than the King's Court, so that Wolsey, in order to save his career, had to give it to Henry VIII, and in fact didn't save his career. He was destroyed by Hampton Court, I think. Now, what do you make of this gatehouse? Seems to me that the fundamental design is a Gothic gatehouse, and it has indeed a Gothic arch to go through. But then it's got these details which are different. The windows now are at least a bit classicizing, but most spectacularly, most interestingly, you have these two roundels. So you have the images of Roman emperors, so as to evoke the beloved classical antiquity. It was, I think, the roundels were made by Italian craftsmen. The model for the roundels would have been Renaissance medals, and the model for the Renaissance medals would have been ancient Roman coins. I think putting those things on the medieval gatehouse was a signal that Wolsey is a man of taste, that he loves classical antiquity as you're supposed to do, and so on. Now, some other cases are a bit stranger, or I want to say something briefly about two churches built in Paris in the 16th century. Both of them began in the early 16th century, but they took some time to finish. That is part of the explanation for the hybridity, but not altogether. This one is Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, a very fashionable church to this day. And so you've got the rose window, which is pure Gothic, but then you've got this gateway, which is almost pure Renaissance, and so it is all the way around. And the other one is Saint-Eustache, which is close to Les Halles, which I don't illustrate because on a slide this size, or with this kind of resolution, which is not as sharp as one might like, it just looks like a Gothic church. But when you're actually either outside or inside it, when you're really only a few feet away, you can see, once again, rather like Christopher Wren's Westminster Abbey, lots of classical detail. But you step away and it disappears and you have a Gothic impression. In the case of Saint-Eustache, Anthony Blunt, who wrote a lot about French architecture, called it a Gothic structure clothed in Renaissance forms. And I think the process of hybridization, to get back to the process, was encouraged by the manner in which the new style spread. And how did people get to know that there was this classical style of building? If they traveled, they could see examples of it, but I think what traveled more rapidly were the treatises on classical architecture, including the rules of classical architecture. Treatises that were mainly produced in Italy, though not always, but translated sometimes rapidly into other languages. The most popular one was by Sebastiano Serlio, which was translated into 6 languages, including Latin, which helped it diffuse still more widely, I think, but by the first decades of the 17th century. Now, we know from library inventories of all sorts of important people, that is, people who had the money and the power to build on a grand scale. From the inventories of their libraries, we know that they owned often several of these treatises. Again, just to give an English example, William Cecil Lord Burleigh, the most powerful minister of Queen Elizabeth I, his hobby was building. And luckily, Burleigh House, which is on the edge of Northamptonshire, still exists. But Cecil, of course, or Burleigh, whichever you prefer to call him, he was writing letters every day and he would write to the ambassador in Paris about politics, of course, but then at the end of the letter, in one case, he said, please look out for some books on architecture. I haven't got enough of them here. And sure enough, one of the French treatises by the architect Philibert Delorme shows up in Cecil's library. So, knowing all that, then the last little bit has to be speculation, but I like to imagine the patron holding a copy of one of these treatises and talking to the master mason and telling them what to do. And so you have the encounter between the mason, who has his training in a more traditional style, and the patron, who has got this book with a few illustrations of the new one. I think misunderstanding probably played a role, as it so often does in history, though historians are, for some reason, rather reluctant to write about this as much as they could. The hybridization of architecture was also encouraged by what you might call cultural translation at second hand. You know, the idea of, in the 16th century, many books that were translated were not translated from the language they were written in. They were translated from another translation. People didn't worry about that. They had their attitude to translation was much freer, to put it mildly, than the attitude to translation that became dominant from the 19th century on. Well, something similar can be seen in architecture. Of course, the spread of the new style over much of Europe was assisted by a diaspora of Italian artists and artisans in Bohemia and Moravia, as in other parts of Europe. Only, although there were many Italians willing to emigrate and work in this way, there weren't enough of them to go round. I think the supply was not sufficient to meet the demand for the new style, which means that Italianate motifs were introduced into some places by artisans who were not Italian. In Scotland, French masons brought the Renaissance style. In Denmark, it was Dutch artisans or Flemish who brought the new style. And so, thinking in terms of the habitus, we get further and further away from the ancient Roman original. And to take an extreme case, I've forgotten that was there, but we'll come back to that. So east of here, this is a chapel in Lviv, known as the Boyne Chapel after the family that paid for it. And I think this is a particularly interesting case, which is linked to the fact that in this period, this is the very beginning of the 17th century in this case, the city was a multicultural or hybrid city with different ethnic groups coexisting and interacting. Now we know this chapel was designed by a German, but a German from Silesia, which was already then a rather culturally hybrid place. He had some artisans from his own region, but they were working with Armenians from the city of Lviv itself, because ever since the 14th century, or maybe earlier, Lviv had a substantial Armenian minority living there. It is possible that some Italians also took part, because North Italian artisans were working at this time at Zamość in Poland, which is actually not too far away. And interaction between these groups led to the development of this local style. I don't think you see this anywhere else, which was once described by a Polish historian of architecture, the late Adam Miłowiecki, as, I quote, richly decorated Netherlandish mannerism, blending with Oriental Armenian motifs and with a Venetian version of the Tuscan and Doric orders. Well, the resolution is going to be good enough to see all that, but it gives some idea of an extreme case of hybridization. And then there are also the practical reasons for the need to adapt a style that had been created for a relatively warm climate, and if you transplant it to a colder part of Europe, some changes have to be made. Obviously, chimneys are more necessary in some places than in Rome or South Italy. But what do you do? Architects sometimes felt a bit embarrassed about chimneys because that looked rather unclassical. In the case of one English country house of the 16th century, the chimneys on the roof are disguised by making them Ionic columns with Ionic capitals. They look totally absurd up there on the roof, but you can understand that he wanted to do something about this. Alternatively, you followed Italy more closely, but then you might be liable to criticism for practical reasons. Take the case of Inigo Jones, who is the greatest British architect of the Renaissance. I nearly said English, but of course he's a Welshman, and that would have been a terrible mistake. Inigo Jones had spent quite a lot of time in Italy studying both the ancient buildings and the work of Italian architects. He was a great enthusiast for Palladio. And then Queen Anne, that is not the Queen Anne of the 18th century, but the wife of James I, asked him to build something for her on the outskirts of London. It's called Queen's House, Greenwich, marvellous building, and with a rather nice piece of creative borrowing, Inigo Jones took the design for the Palazzo Chiericati in Vicenza and he turned it inside out. That is, the parts that were hollowed out became solid and the parts that were solid became hollowed out. And it looks very fine, but it was criticized at the time because of the open portico. In Italy, I quote, "This is proper and useful because it abates heat and averts the force of the sun's light, which is offensive. On the other hand, in England, we have, generally speaking, too much air and too little heat. So it's beautiful, but it's totally impractical." We find many English country houses of this period, they were built with an open portico, but later on, a later owner has put in a glass wall so as to solve the problem. Adaptation took place not only in practice, but it was sometimes justified in architectural theory. The most interesting case I know, the most explicit case I know, comes from a Netherlander, Frederman de Vries, who is much better known for his designs so that other people can build than for anything that he built himself. So he writes in the introduction to one of his pattern books that classical rules may be broken to accommodate art to the situation and the needs of the country. Writing in French, he says, accommoder. This is interesting because it's just the word that the Jesuit missionaries used to use. When what they are recommending is what we call cultural translation. So, with the reference to the Jesuits, this is my cue to say something about what happened to Renaissance architecture when an attempt was made to export it to the New World of Mexico and Peru. The so-called expansion of Europe in the 16th century, in other words, the conquest of parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas, had important cultural consequences as well as economic and political and demographic. Obviously, they included attempts to convert local populations to Catholicism and, connected with that, to transport Renaissance and later Baroque art and architecture to the New World. In the case of Mexico, the resulting hybrid style of painting has been perceptively analysed in the last few years by a French historian, not historian of art, Serge Gruzinski. In the case of architecture, the Spaniards made relatively few concessions to local tradition. Indeed, on occasion, it's been argued that the Renaissance style both represented and reinforced the Spanish belief that their civilization was superior to that of the Aztecs and the Incas. All the same, they built churches on the site of earlier temples, and they sometimes used the same stones, as in the case of the Cathedral of Cusco. They were well advised to do this because the Inca masons knew how to make a building more or less earthquake-proof, and the Europeans didn't have this technique. But, so at the level of conscious intentions, no hybridity, very often. but in both Mexico and Peru there was a shortage of Spanish craftsmen. So they had to recruit the indigenous population and turn them into masons and sculptors. Now, of course, these indigenous people who had often not worked in stone before, but still they had their own traditions, their own habitus. As a result, the sculpture on church facades of the 16th and 17th centuries in the New World, and perhaps particularly in the Viceroyalty of Peru, they may have been classical in grammar, but definitely partly indigenous in lexicon. This is the facade of the church in Arequipa, Peru, which is known locally as the Compañía, and that's because it was built for what we call in English the Society of Jesus, but in many languages it's the Company of Jesus, the military language of the ex-soldier Ignatius Loyola. And so you see it's got the classical columns in the right places, and you've got the pediments and so on, but what I find most remarkable, and what art historians also comment on, is there's no blank space. So you have this covering of the surface with these decorative motifs. And it's been pointed out that some of this decoration looks rather like the decoration of textiles, which was one of the main forms of artistic expression in Peru before the Spaniards arrived. So that's already quite interesting. Now, in the 16th century, I think it's the second stage of the hybridization process. You can see a combination of local and imported motifs. In one city, provincial city, Sucre, you find classical columns, only they resemble the trunks of palm trees. Though that innovation was not taken up elsewhere. The third stage was reached, I think, in the beginning of the 17th century, as in the case of this facade I'm showing you, a distinctive Peruvian ecotype, which some art historians, when they write in Spanish, call the estilo mestizo, or if they write in English, they call it hybrid baroque. And this hybrid style includes, what I can't show you here, indigenous animals like the puma on the church facades, where in Europe you would expect maybe a wolf or a lion. In painting too, there was a Peruvian ecotype in religious art. I believe it's true to say that only in Peru can you see paintings of angels carrying guns. But this became enormously fashionable in the 17th century. And attempts have been made to explain this as a kind of syncretism with local religious beliefs in the power of thunder, and that these firearms represented the power of thunder. I don't know whether that is a correct interpretation, but it's been interestingly put forward. So that brings one to the question of religion in the New World. Now, the Arequipa example is not alone in suggesting that this hybrid style may have been encouraged by the Jesuits in particular. After all, their missionary strategy in so many parts of the world was what they called accommodation. You had to accommodate Christianity to the local tradition. That is, you keep its essence, but you're allowed to change more superficial features. I think hybridity is often the result of accommodation or compromise. Interesting, the term accommodation has recently come into use in linguistics. More exactly, it's come back into use because, as far as I know, the earliest use of the term was in rhetoric in ancient Rome. Quintilian talks about accommodatio. What he means is that the orator, speaking to different audiences, has needs to adapt the style of speaking to the needs of those audiences. The Jesuits take up this idea and say then that we have to adapt the Christian message to what we would call the different cultures in which they're preaching it. Well, if you're prepared to do that, then I don't think it would be difficult to swallow the hybrid style in architecture. But then maybe it's also interesting that they're Spanish Jesuits, because the hybrid style of Peru may have been encouraged by the interpenetration of Christian and Muslim cultures in medieval Spain. Now let's see if I can do this. I've got to get back to the image we passed through before, but let's... That's it. Wonderful. Thank you. Because after all, in medieval Spain, there was a division into Christian and Muslim kingdoms, indeed into Christian and Muslim cultures, but there was also a whole medieval history of interpenetration. Arabs who were converted to Christianity, and Spaniards who went Muslim, and so on. And so, both in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, you'll find buildings including Christian churches in Toledo, in Alcalá, elsewhere. Christian churches decorated by Muslim artisans in what they call now the mudéjar style, making use then of geometrical and calligraphic motifs of the kind to be found in mosques. So thinking about Mexico and Peru, I simply wanted to suggest that the Spanish colonial patrons of architecture were already prepared by their experience in their own peninsula, at home in Spain, to favour, or at the very least to accept, a mixture of artistic traditions. So let me try to move towards a more general conclusion. That's it. So I've been talking about cultural translation, about bricolage, about mixing. And what happens in architecture has, of course, parallels in other media and art forms. Think of the classicization or Latinization of European vernaculars, such as Italian, French, English, German. Not only in the vocabulary, though of course there was a borrowing of hundreds and hundreds of Latin words, but also the changes in grammar. For example, that German habit, which the English find quite extraordinary, of placing three verbs at the end of a sentence, that wasn't always true of German. It came in at the Renaissance, apparently a fashionable imitation of Cicero, who also liked to end his sentences with more than one verb. But for some reason it stuck, and it's still there, at least in the discourse of an elderly German professor. Now, so the result of the great collision between the Gothic system and the classical system was eventually the production of new ecotypes in England, France, Bohemia, and elsewhere. And I particularly like the term ecotype because it offers a solution to a big problem which we could call the problem of original purity. The idea of cultural hybridity has often been criticized on the grounds it falsely assumes the purity of the different cultures which are then hybridized at a particular moment. But of course we know classical culture was not pure. The Romans imitated the Greeks learned from other cultures as well. Medieval culture was even less pure, since in a sense it arose out of a fusion of classical tradition, Christian culture, and what one might call the civilization of the barbarians, that is, the Goths, the Franks, the Vandals, and so on. So if every culture is hybrid, is it useful to talk about cultural hybridity? So now there are, I think, two possible replies. That is, I can think of two useful replies to this criticism, which the first is to say that the process of hybridization, even if it's always occurring, is much more intense or much more rapid at certain times than others. In England, it's impossible not to think of 1066 and the Norman conquest, and what happened to language with so many French words coming in that Anglo-Saxon turns into medieval English, or indeed, and the Anglo-Saxon, the style of architecture, which was very distinctive, is replaced by international Romanesque. But there's another possible reply to the objection. The third phase of hybridization, I think, produces new ecotypes, what I was calling creoles, and they remain relatively stable, or if you prefer, relatively pure, until the next cultural encounter. And then the process of hybridization occurs all over again. So I've got a kind of cyclical picture of a period of intense borrowing and change, followed by a period of relative stability and integration, and then another cultural encounter, and so on. And it's very hard to distinguish the two, so that Botticelli has achieved a kind of fusion. And Edgar Windt, I think, probably learned this from his master, Abi Warburg, who once wrote a famous essay about a Florentine merchant of the late 15th century in his will, in which classical ideas and Christian ideas appear to be all mixed up together. But what I do think is that the current interest in cultural hybridity, in the case of the Renaissance, involves a big change of emphasis that still requires further exploration. So what I'm concerned with is, can we move the concept of hybrid Renaissance from the periphery of Renaissance studies a bit closer to the centre? I don't know how far, because you have to have people do the research and produce the conclusions to see how far the thing would go. Now, I think what's particularly interesting, this approach focuses attention on a range of artifacts, Renaissance artifacts, big ones, small ones, that the earlier approaches neglected, precisely because they didn't offer sufficiently clear, distinct, or pure examples of Renaissance art. So they weren't textbook examples, so they weren't illustrated in the histories of art. So people didn't look at them, or didn't look at them so carefully. And yet those mixed productions have their place in history, and what is more, I think they have a beauty of their own, and we shouldn't allow any purist prejudices to stop us appreciating that. Thank you. So again, if people want to ask questions, would they speak as loudly and clearly as possible, because I don't hear as well as I used to. I probably will approach you anyway if you speak somewhere near the back, but I do welcome reactions. They don't have to be questions, they could be comments, but I do welcome dialogue. Yeah, please.
Thanks for this wonderful ride on that metaphor of hybridization. Being one of those German elderly professors, but I will speak English. One aspect of the hybrid in classics can be that they have features that are exaggerated.
Yeah.
So particularly big blossoms, particularly strong stems or whatever. Do we have cases in the hybridization, the Renaissance, or in those fusions? Do we have cases where features we would not find in that, to that extent, in a pure model, but we find it in the bastardized, in the hybrid? Do you understand the question?
So things we don't find in...
Say, things that are present, say, in the Gothic style,
yes,
would be exaggerated,
yes,
in, say, in Pienza.
Yes.
Or so.
Yes.
Do we have cases of that?
I'm not sure about exaggerated, but certainly combined. Mm-hmm. And then something that I didn't say, because it's not so true of architecture as it's true of the decoration of small objects. It seems it's more accepted to hybridize in some media and some art forms than others, and the decorative arts, with the rise of the grotesque, it was a lucky fit between the grotesque of ancient Rome discovered when they excavated Nero's house and the medieval tradition of grotesque. And you can see artists are drawing on both. But that I didn't discuss, because in architecture, except maybe in little corners of decoration, you don't see it as vividly. I suppose spectacularly, you have the rise of arabesque in the beginning of the 16th century. So this time it's not Spanish, it's the Italian artists, especially the Venetian artists, who are particularly aware of Middle Eastern art forms, because Venice is trading so much with Damascus and Aleppo, and they bring it in. But I think that might have been shocking if it had been applied to architecture. But if it's a plate or if it's a metal jug, that's all fine.
Maybe, I don't know, but maybe the Renaissance strikes us as a particular and different example for the hybrid in culture, because you took, as one of the literature examples, you took Ariosto, and Ariosto is a case where the hybridization is 100% conscious, presupposing, which is not a given for all cases, the belief in the existence of pure style, and deliberately mixing the rules for a certain taste of freedom, and also for a certain, you mentioned Venice, where it would occur most often, for a certain wish to take the best from all. And I think that this is something that distinguishes especially the Mannerist period of Renaissance culture from all, we could say, involuntary or simply habitually impurity of style wherever else it might occur. When you think of such a figure as Doni, who is, a jack of all trades, Doni, who will write about everything, and I think not because he is convinced to be the best in each field, but because he wants to meddle in each field. He wants to be involved in each field, which I think is new, which I think really is Renaissance.
Yeah. Yes, it's hard to think of a writer more self-conscious about this kind of thing than Ariosto. But I find it more difficult to think of writers as hybridizing unconsciously than maybe of people who are constructing buildings and sculpture. So I'm trying to think about Rabelais in this way. So he has a very good humanist education. The book is full of humanist allusions. The humor is almost entirely medieval, and the famous meeting with Panurge is rather like the farce of Patelin and so on. Does he put this together altogether consciously, or just what he thinks is funny is in the medieval tradition, and so he just does it without needing to think about it? I don't know. And then another intriguing case is Montaigne, because maybe it doesn't seem at all medieval, but he praises medieval writers, which is, I think, relatively unusual for somebody writing in the late 16th century. And then that relaxed style of his, I know it's got a possible classical model, it's a Senecan way of writing, but it's also a bit more like the medieval way of writing, for example, of Froissart, whom Montaigne says he admires, and very far away from the Ciceronian sentence. But I can't think of a literary example where it doesn't seem much more like conscious syncretism than it seems like habitus.
I also would like to thank you for a very interesting lecture. And I have two little questions. The first one, have you published this lecture in some study or in some book? I mean, this focus on architecture. This is the first one. And the second question, have you interested yourself also with the architectural tradition in Renaissance in independent different Italian regions? I mean, Veneto, Lombardy, Friuli and others. Because these are also very different, yes, when we take a nearer look.
So the first thing is that this is going to be part of 3 lectures I give in Budapest in the autumn, and the requirement for those lectures is that they should be published, and they can be in enlarged form. So that leads on that there will be space in the, if not in the 3 lectures, then in the book that results, to address this question of the region. And what I think is particularly interesting is the interaction between different regions of Italy and different countries outside Italy. So the French Renaissance, insofar as it was brought by Italians, was more brought by Lombards, but, with exceptions, because I showed Domenico da Cortona, but still a lot of Lombards were involved. On the other hand, to South Germany and that sort of area, it came more from Venice, which had, obviously, they had distinct styles. One could regard Lombard architecture of the 16th century as hybrid itself, because it keeps up the heavily decorative medieval tradition, although it's introduced all sorts of classical motif. And then there's the intriguing, but then sometimes one will find an almost pure case of Tuscan, because it was a group of Tuscan craftsmen. They go, I think, to Visegrad in the age of Marcus Corvinus. And so in these different parts of Europe, according to which kind of Italian they had, the regional variation will be, it's like translation at second hand, and again, it's something too to be said about the south of Italy in Neapolitan style, but I'm not sure I know enough to talk about that. But yeah, I promise it will be in the book.
Well, my question is slightly off topic, but it's about another 16th century process of revival, or other process which claimed being a revival, the Reformation.
Yeah.
Do you think we can apply the concept of cultural hybridity on the Reformation as well? Or do you see any strengths or weaknesses of that approach?
That's a very interesting question, because one can see the writings of many reformers as a condemnation of cultural hybridity, the residue of paganism that they see in popular culture and so on. So maybe I can ask you, what kind of hybridity do you see in the writers of the reformers themselves? I mean, well, Calvin's had a good classical education. He will write in a good Latin, maybe you could say even maybe a humanist style, but that's the style. The content is uncompromising and not very favourable to images and so on. So I'm sure Calvin would have hated to be called hybrid, but do you see something in here? Luther, I can see there's maybe a better case because Luther is more accommodating. Isn't it? Somebody went to visit him late in Luther's life, and in his study there was an image of the Virgin Mary. He didn't think that it was wrong to have such an image. He was only concerned with the way in which it was venerated. Is that hybridity or not? It's less radical than other Protestant reformers. So I can't think of a good example of hybridity, but there must be something that you're thinking of that I haven't switched on to yet.
No, I just thought in general, because that was actually the approach of the reformers, that they wanted to get rid of all, say, pagan or Roman influences. But in the same time, of course, say, Luther was coming back to St. Augustine and so on, so probably there were some deep forms of hybridity as well.
Maybe we should shift round from the writings of reformers, because obviously they're trying to purify the church, to what happens in practice, and then one would expect to see much more hybridity. Yes, I'm trying to think, in the 17th century, an English gentleman visited those Gaelic-speaking islands like the Hebrides, and his image of the local religion, it was divided into three archaeological strata, because superficially they were Protestant, but he noticed the remains of Catholicism, and as he saw it, the remains of paganism underneath that, and which is a reminder then of how far practice doesn't move at the same speed as ideas. Yeah.
Maybe I could add an element.
Yeah.
Certainly in the Protestant culture, a certain kind of hybridization occurs with the revival of the Old Testament.
Yeah.
Because the treatment of Protestantism and, well, their claim to revive the virtues of the Old Testament and their stressing the Old Testament, which is rather father off than Augustine, led to a certain hybridization of religious life as such. People of this late time, trying directly, for instance in America, to imitate the life of the Old Testament.
Yeah, thank you for that idea. Yes, so maybe somebody could write a book about hybrid reformation, but I don't think it would be me. Yeah, please.
I would like to ask about one thing. What you were mentioning mostly were newly built churches which were culturally hybrid. But we have many examples, and maybe much more than these, where the church, the building is built and then it is reconstructed again and again. You touched on that. But can you call that cultural hybridity, or is it rather a mixture? Because there can be a pure Gothic style, which is then where they add pure Renaissance, for example. So what to do with that?
Yes, I think it's rather like the second stage, because you have a juxtaposition and no interaction. And that was why I went into the 17th century, so that one could find the true third stage, because architects like Christopher Wren were actually trying to modify their style to harmonize with the Gothic structure that was already there. So mostly I think you find the second stage. It's a kind of cultural apartheid. And it's a kind of shock as you move from one half of the church into the other, and the style changes, and there's no concession made by the second style. It doesn't echo, refer to the other part of the church at all. But with Milan Cathedral and with Westminster Abbey, you've got this much more interesting, deliberate attempt to reconcile.
Yeah,
much rarer, I think.
There's maybe one thing that the parts may be separated, but they may interact in the way that there's the big structure, and then in it are Renaissance windows, for example.
Yes.
Or various details which are brought there only later on. So it's a kind of mixture, it's a kind of hybrid, but it is not built in the same time. So there is no actual interaction of the architects, of the masons and so on. So that's maybe also.
And it would be very interesting to know what contemporaries thought of it at the moment that was done. But I've never seen any textual evidence of reactions of that kind to the partial rebuilding of a church or whatever. I'd love to find one, yeah.
We'll look for it.
Do you agree that the architecture, especially Renaissance, is primarily involved by their festive functions? If the Renaissance architecture, by your opinion, is involved by primarily by festive functions?
Well, yes. The temporary architecture that was put up for festivals could be, since it could be constructed so quickly and it was relatively inexpensive, it was possible to innovate much more quickly. And we don't really know, and it would be good to know, how far the temporary architecture produced for festive functions then influenced the permanent architecture produced in the same place in the years afterwards, because people had seen a really classical triumphal arch that had been erected because the ruler had made state entry into a particular city. So there's a greater freedom when it's temporary as well.
Yeah, but some architectures, for example, town halls, are on the inside the town, like Teatro Mundi. The whole world is the city, and inside the processions, some these processions can integrate the facades of town halls and churches with this temporary architectures.
Yes, and so in those cases it's more permissible to give up the Latin cross pattern and to adopt a different, as in pilgrimage churches, Though, did it happen in the Renaissance, or did it only happen in the 17th or perhaps the early 18th century? I'm not sure about that. Yes, thinking of Vierzehnheiligen, and or thinking of examples in Moravia as well. I'm just not sure about that.
You mentioned, may I come back to your wonderful example of Pienza?
Yes.
This is really striking example of hybridity once appearing inside of the church. But there is also the palace, which was built, I'm not sure if I'm not mistaken, please correct me, but it seemed it was built very same time, ordered by the very same man, Pius II. But the palace itself is not hybrid at all. It's a pure, I would say pure early Renaissance building, without arcades, nothing Gothic inside. Maybe it was built even by the same masons,
Yes.
who just few steps from the park built that
Yes.
Gothic Renaissance church. How you would explain that? Hybrid, but in the very same time, don't build me hybrid here.
It makes it look as if the patron might have intervened precisely because he liked Strasbourg Cathedral. Then he wanted some references to that sort of, whereas for the palace, he hadn't seen such wonderful palaces in Germany, so then he would go for the pure style. Yes, it's intriguing. It's exactly the opposite of the situation in Moscow, that is, at the beginning of the 16th century, when Tsar Ivan III has an Italian architect at court, Aristotele Fioravanti from Bologna, and allows him to design a
Have you looked for and possibly found some hybrid structures in Olomouc?
So far I've only found a kind of urban, rather pure Italian Baroque, but of course I haven't been properly taken around the city yet. I'm waiting to discover all sorts of things.
Any more questions or comments? Not, then thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for the lectures. And hope to see you again.